Professor Howard Williams takes you on a journey through time and space, exploring death and memory, past and present. Archaeodeath.
So, hello everyone, I'm Irina from Shield of Skuld. It's my pleasure to be here once again with Howard from Archaeodeath. Hello, Howard.
Hi,
And
everyone.
we are very pleased and delighted to continue our interesting conversation from last time about mortuary practices, religion, identity, memory, and all kinds of fun stuff from the greatest centuries of mankind, right? The early Middle Ages.
The only centuries that matter,
Exactly.
everything else is a footnote.
Right. So, Howard, you've been dealing quite a lot with material culture and the relationship between material culture and identity. So, maybe we can start by delving a little bit into the different roles material culture might play in early medieval commemoration.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, isn't it? Because we have a lot of stuff. We have a lot of stuff we find in graves, and it's trying to we make lots of we've got sorts of deep set assumptions about what that stuff meant. Why were people getting rid of that? Why was stuff going into graves? And I suppose there's a number of different ways to introduce this. Firstly, to introduce that there's lots of different societies over large geographical regions that bury their dead with things. This is nothing exceptional for the Viking Age. This isn't some unique worldview. This isn't some singular moment in time. We have if we just restrict ourselves to the Northern European Iron Age, late Bronze Age, Iron Age, we have traditions where people are interring the dead in ceramic vessels, cremated. We have artifacts from the pyres that are going in with those vessels. Sometimes they're burying the dead without the vessels, and sometimes they're burying only a portion of the cremated dead with some, items that are not burnt. So there's these overlapping different options there. And then if you're burying the dead unburnt, which takes place in overlapping trends in different regions and places, you have the choice to bury selected objects that were associated with costume, items that were added to the grave, perhaps within a coffin or within some kind of container or structure, some objects outside of the structure. So I suppose my point is there's no single type of grave good. There's no single type of material. They all seem to be associated with perhaps different stages of the funeral, to do with the preparation and transportation and interment of the dead, whether you're cremating or inhuming. There's a lot of variability, and archaeologists have long thought of the questions: why are people burying this stuff? And the two kind of answers people come up with that we still dance around, really. We're still playing this dance between these two options. I say dance because lots of scholars say they take on board both poles to oppositions, but most scholars sort of sit somewhere in between seeing it as about belief, some kind of expectation that those objects will be for the dead, with the dead, into some afterlife,
and they reflect
realm.
Their own beliefs.
Yeah.
Their beliefs and their status, their identity.
And then you have the social, which can connect to that. So one can presume the other, but they are kind of they dance, and the other is the social identity, as you say, that somehow therefore those items were put there to honor the specific identity of that dead person. And in Viking Age studies, we have this strange little weird cul-de-sac of archaeology that seems to still think we can easily just read off graves. We can go, a comb. This person was clearly a person who valued their hair, and their comb was clearly they were called Thorfinn comb hair or whatever, or some kind of, they think it's so indelibly linked and so uniquely, associated with that person. If they have brooches. So they are a particular status. Maybe they are housewives, or they are, if they have swords, they are warriors, and so we still like to think that we can read off the dead from the graves, because we make the assumption the objects were put there for their personal biography into the afterlife, and that they are a decision made by the dead person themselves or by immediate family, who said, we must honor him, her, them in this way to reflect what we want them to be in the next world. And the problem is
the dead don't bury themselves.
They don't bury themselves, but they don't even necessarily bury themselves with even a fraction of what those people had. And we actually have a few written sources
Yeah.
from the early Middle Ages that make this honestly clear. And they don't necessarily relate to Scandinavia and to the Viking Age fully, but you have, for example, descriptions of the Ests who in the court of Alfred the Great, isn't it? Where I think it's the Count of Wulstan or something. Maybe it's a bit later than Alfred the Great, but it's certainly a source that sort of talks about the division of property. And even Ibn Fadlan, when he's writing about the objects and the preparation of the funeral on the Volga amongst the Rus, who are not necessarily all Scandinavian or primarily Scandinavian, but my point would in this sense is to say that we know that a lot of the objects associated with that funeral of an exceptionally wealthy person are not necessarily objects that they had or were theirs. They were only a fraction of the objects, and they were objects made for the funeral. I mean, there's huge categories. The other thing is the archaeological evidence. We have huge evidence, huge categories of evidence that don't appear in graves. Silver is the literal lifeblood of the Viking world, and the trade and commerce and exchange and personal display, and yet silver items rarely make it into graves. And there's some really obvious reasons why you don't put silver with the dead, is that you know that those items could very easily be hoiked out again, or they were put with the dead and they were removed out again. And that links to our discussion
last time. To my
knowledge,
time. Most of it is in, I think, is in treasure hoards. At least if we look at the example of the island of Gotland, I think it's in the hundreds of thousands, sorry, discovered there. Most of them are in hoards. And what's interesting is that it is often found, at least on the island of Gotland, in households. I mean, in the ground of the households. So maybe it was placed there to be recovered at some point, or perhaps also, but I think here it's a bit far-fetched to try to think of a religious reason maybe for that, because I think Snorri at some point has one remark where he says that you are going to take your treasures with you when you go to Valhall. So maybe we can draw a connection there. But yeah, I definitely agree with you that it's very, very problematic to associate all these objects with the social identities of these people when they were alive. And the cemetery of Valsierde just came to my mind, because there is a grave there, for example, which is classified as a warrior grave because it has, all these classic characteristics of a lot of weapons being present there, from spears to swords and so on. But then there is also cooking equipment, and quite a lot of cooking equipment in it. So the question is, what was this person actually, and why are there so many objects of different value associated with this particular grave? So how do we really identify who these people were? I mean, I don't think we can give it up completely, the possibility that these objects actually tell something about who you were in your real life, in your when you were alive. But at the same time, I think it's exaggerated to associate everything with what you did. And also one important point to make, I think, is perhaps also that the most valuable objects, they were not put in graves. They would have been kept by the family.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of these objects, they seem to be used. They seem to have been used actually for quite a long time. Sometimes they're broken, even repaired. I mean, you have clear marks on it on them that they would have been repaired or mended in some way or another. So yeah, if you have such complexity of objects ranging from swords to glass vessels and all kinds of objects like scissors or whatever, what can you actually say about the identity of these people and who they were and what they were doing while they were alive?
So for those listening to this, we're not saying you can't say anything from graves. What we're trying to outline and sketch out for those who may not be familiar is that there's a number of interpretive stages, in the same way as there's interpretive stages to interpreting an Icelandic manuscript. There's not simply the translation and, well, it says it there, and that's it. There's this in the same way as interpreting a grave is reading a text. It's a text that has multiple authors, different agents, the dead themselves, the family, the broader audience that you're serving. There would be social expectations, but also there may have been lots of contingencies, lots of circumstances, the circumstances of death itself, timing within seasons, what they expect, what they want to say about the dead in the particular circumstances of that person
so essentially
dying.
Creating an image of the dead.
So it's not saying that there were no warriors in the Viking Age, because when we find a weapon in a grave, that weapon burial, as we tend to call it, rather than warrior grave, as some even recent reports have misleadingly called them, this weapon burial could well have been someone who wielded that weapon in life, was trained in its use, or had a status in which that weapon had a real important political social function. I'm not denying that, but to assume that this is some kind of, this may have been something that they used 30, 40 years earlier, it may have been their third best weapon, and the other two items go to the son and daughter, or the nephew. There may be, we've got to understand these items within complex decisions and circulations of objects, and as you say, biographies of objects, heirlooms. And so I've seen some scholars even quite recently say, oh, the idea of heirlooms is just an excuse for not connecting objects to people in graves. And I think we have to flip that around and say, why are you, not you personally, why are we as a society so obsessed with fixating on the link between things and individuals? Because we're in a society absolutely obsessed with connecting things to people. So, nobody even in our society would probably be outraged if I said that an object that was used for feasting and eating and cooking and drinking could have been a really important item, not because it was linked to one individual, but because that item had been received as a gift, given to a man, given to his wife. The wife gives it to her daughter. The daughter then gives it to her husband, and that object then enters his funerary context. And I don't think people would think that outrageous or silly, to think that by putting that object in the grave, it's no less meaningful. In fact, it's more meaningful that that object is connected to the dead person, their wife, let me remember my own root, their mother and their father, and then to potentially a story of its acquisition on a raid, its acquisition in trade, its giving from a chieftain. These objects suddenly are redolent with meaning, but they're not meaning tied to that one person. And to try and constantly make everything we find in graves about the identity of the person they're buried with is a really, shall we say, weird flex that reflects our modern obsession with pinning down people's identity that would have changed within their own lifetime, but also was subject to negotiation at the funeral. So the funeral is a time where these points are made, these arguments, these narratives are constructed about a person. So why do we have this constant argument with people about, well, what did this particular object mean to at time of burial? Well, even if you were there, even if I could time travel back 1,000 years and attend one of these chamber burials at the Swedish Emporium of Birka, I would still be wondering, well, who in the audience is thinking about why that second spearhead was thrown into the grave? Why were they putting another axe by that body? Why are they sacrificing 2 horses, not one? Would everyone know, even if they were there? And these decisions may have been made and performed, and most people probably understood broadly what they intended to convey, but there may have been different intended audiences and with different significances to the items. And there still would have been those personal decisions where somebody leaves an object because of its particular association, not just with an individual, but with a whole group of people. So these were people who weren't living in a society of atomized individuals. They were honoring the dead in relation to their social, economic, political networks. And yes, sometimes I bet those graves are telling a story that is reflective of that person's identity to some degree. But I suppose, just another point to throw out there, if you literally believe that these individuals are buried as they lived, they like toppled into the grave with the objects they had, and you look at a site like Birka, which has, I don't know how many off the top of my head, a couple of there's about there's only a minority of the burials that have been excavated. There's only a fraction of the burials have been excavated. Of those, only a fraction of them have weapons. If we take that as a literal representation of weapon use in the 250, 300 years, just crudely bracketing the occupation at that site, if you believe there's less, what you're trying to say is there's less than sort of 300 warriors over 300 years, or 200 warriors over 250 years. So I don't know the exact fraction, but my point would be that surely cannot reflect the weapon use in that society, the identities in that society. Likewise, the combs or the brooches. So these are objects that they seduce us into thinking. When we see a grave, we think, we can read that like a book. We don't need an interpretation. We don't need to translate. We can go back in time and imagine we're at the graveside and we can just read it off. But I'm trying to say, as an archaeologist, we've kind of moved away from that. And so we are more cautious. And we try to look at the objects as an assemblage, not just look at the individual objects. And I suppose that's the opening points I want to make, is that there was no single Viking way of death. There was a lot of variability, but the individual objects within choice of the grave may have been motivated by a whole range of different associations, rather than he will need this or she will need this in Valhalla or whatever, this kind of Hollywood view of Vikings and our obsession with individual identity. That's my rant. Sorry, Irina.
Yeah, no, I was thinking also about what you mentioned before, our obsession with possessing objects. And I think one important point that I've actually noticed in another context, so not in archaeology, but while studying the legendary sagas and the weapons in the legendary sagas, were the magic swords, for example. Because these magic swords, they're always presented as being somewhat personified, somewhat with a will of their own. And this is very interesting for me because not only because, okay, they influenced Tolkien, that's another point, but also because, sometimes I think with an object, you can form a connection in the sense of that is somehow in your ecology through its history, through its circulation, through its multiple reusages and significance for the broader community you were part of. But somehow you were in something together. So in a warrior, for example, with a sword. And here you have a lot of examples from the legendary sagas. There is one particular saga I really enjoy, the saga of Hromund. And Hromund here, he breaks in the mound of Thrain. Thrain is presented as this very ancient warrior, again a reference to the ancient past that needs to be confronted, and he takes the sword from him. The sword carries a very interesting name. It is called Misteltein, so from mistletoe, and you can draw a little connection here to the mistletoe significance in Norse mythology. My point is here that you're really trying to make this connection to the past by resorting to these objects and creating new contexts for them. So they're basically integrated into this larger ecology. You shouldn't be seeing them only as objects with absolutely no significance whatsoever than to, declare your status or your wealth, your elite position, and so on. They were actually they actually had a selfhood of their own, or the way they were used. Or you do have an interesting example in the saga of Cormac, where, again, the hero Cormac the Skald, he gets this sword with special capabilities, but he cannot use the sword unless he performs a specific ritual for that sword. Because the sword, when it is pulled out of the scabbard, there is this little snake crawling up the hilt and then moves up in the knob. Anyway, it's a very weird story. But if he doesn't perform this ritual, then the sword is not going to function. And this actually happens. He cannot use the sword because he refuses to perform the ritual. So in the sense, I think that objects should rather be seen as this kind of active participant in this whole process, rather than just these passive things that are gathered and thrown away.
So yes, in those later sources, this idea is that object would have no meaning or significance to a person if it hadn't been acquired from an old grave or given, or
there is this constant dialogue with the past, with the ancient past.
And so when we do find these, our argument is actually, rather than less significant, these objects are more significant when we think about the choice to give them up in a grave. We're not saying there wasn't any meanings. We're actually saying that they would have been powerful moments at a funeral, and not always at the grave side, because when you're dealing with a cremation, it'll be on the pyre where you're maybe over a number of hours and different ceremonies, you're adding objects, and then so these funerals were public events with different stages where there would have been very formalized theatrical elements, but there would also have been a lot of intimate moments.
Yeah, and unfortunately that's lost, right? I mean, this whole element of performance, or the fact that you were mourning that person, that's also lost. That can't really be retrieved from archaeology.
I think so. I mean, what we can say from archaeology, though, is we can look at the broad patterns, and that's where our strength lies in archaeology, is looking at long-term trends over time, regional
Right.
variations, and we can look at big patterns. We can't always tell what people want from us in popular audiences to know their names, their hair color, what they did last Thursday, and exactly how they died and what they thought about the weather. Those kind of things we can't ever reconstruct, and that is, we should celebrate our uncertainties. We should be honest and clear about what we can't say, but then focus on what we can get access to, which is not
How
always,
they perceive death.
yeah,
That's
how
also
they,
an interesting question for me because, we have these later sources, but first of all, yeah, the term Norse mythology, I think it's quite, limited because it's actually old Icelandic mythology. And
yeah.
I'm not very sure whom it was reflective of, like this whole system presented in the Poetic Edda. I'm quite convinced that it would have been a much greater regional diversity than presented in these texts, and probably also more than what we see in the Codex Regius was in circulation at the time. But then there were a bunch of monks who thought, yeah, these are the most interesting ones, we're going to put these down, and we're going to create a story around them. But that's unfortunately a limited perspective. Of course, there are other sources that suggest this great diversity of beliefs in the afterlife and so on, also gods, but we don't really have access to them, do we? I mean,
No.
I personally think that the main belief would have been in some form of continuing your life afterwards, because if you think about the term hell, that comes from a verb which means to hide. So it all started with like seeing that the corpse was hidden somehow, either in a
Yeah.
coffin or in a grave, in a burial mound, in a ship or whatever. And then these ideas, these very complex ideas about Valhall and so on, I think they developed a little later. I
Absolutely.
think the
And
seeds of them can be found during the migration times of the late Iron Age, because we do have bracteates with Odin as well, and so on. But I think the whole concept of Valhall would have been developed later on. So not,
there's different
yeah,
ways. It's really
this.
interesting, isn't it? I think another thing people need to be aware of, and again, this sounds like a killjoy point, is that um, most Viking period graves are poorly preserved. Most of them
Mm,
are not particularly rich. Most of them have just a body with perhaps a few items that might hint they were clothed when buried, or they are cremated remains where there's no items preserved at all. In other words, and there's two ways of looking at that. And I think I've seen, certain scholars in recent times have argued that we should see these poorer graves as relating to poorer people in society, lower
mm-hmm.
socioeconomic classes. There would have been enslaved people, there would have been farm workers, there would have been the servants and so on. And we have to imagine, yes, this was a hierarchical society. But the other
Indeed, yeah.
point is that there may have been a lot of elaborate practices that leave no trace. And we have to remember that, and I think the other point linked to that is that the elaborate burials, when we get them, are often synopsized in pop culture as the Viking way of death. When I think even at their time, even if you were hanging around with the Rus for a whole generation, you would perhaps have not seen what Ibn Fadlan saw. Or if you were in part of, say, Blekinge in southern Sweden for a whole, century, you lived to 101 years old, you may have only had the opportunity to witness a couple of really big funerals in your area for select members, not even everyone from a particular clan or family. Sorry, you would perhaps only seen a few of those funerals, and participated in them and seen bits of it. You may not have been there for the full thing because you had sheep to tend or you had a family to look after. You couldn't be there for the full whatever number of days getting drunk. You perhaps just brought along the beer and then went back home. And in other words, we have to remember that when we find these really wealthy burials, they were probably exceptional in their time, and that's why they were doing them. So rather than just see every other grave as just like cheap versions of the big funerals, that would be like saying that everybody dying in Britain in the last 50 years is simply a cheap version of the funeral of the Queen Mother or Queen Elizabeth II or Margaret Thatcher or Lady Diana, and saying the only funerals that really mattered are those grand public events. Most people don't expect that, don't want that, and would be just going, well, we sacrificed one animal so we have something to eat, and we gave him his favorite buckle and his belt, and that's it, and so I think we have to be careful of sort of over romanticizing and seeing these really exceptional burials as anything other than what they are, is once in a generation, or perhaps a few times in a generation, exceptional funerals that were for the elite to show off and perform their self-importance, and perhaps consolidate alliances, and claim links that they never really had to the land and ancestors.
Yeah, they were creating a story, they were shaping a story, their own narrative. Yeah, exactly. Linking, maybe to the mythical past as well. If you look at some burial mounds that were, erected maybe near some more ancient sites from the Bronze Age, from the Neolithic and so on, there is quite a lot of evidence about that, about the reusing these spots in order to create a deeper connection to the ancient past. But yeah, I totally agree with you. There is a lot of intangible evidence here. And in terms of performance, at least, I can think of a parallel with a term that is frequently used in the sagas, but it's not really specified what it is. The galdrar, the songs, the magical songs, and we don't really know what they were, to what purpose, or what they contained, because the Christian writers, they kept saying that we shouldn't record them because they're blasphemous and maleficent, and we're not going to tell you what they are. So that seems to have been quite an important part of religious rituals, of magical rituals, but then again, we have no way of telling what they actually contained. And it's very interesting because you can also find them in later sources, such as these Old English spells against a dwarf, for example. Again, you have mentions of these older ancient songs being sung, and again, you don't know to what purpose they were sung. So I think something similar might have been happening here. We don't know what these people were speaking when placing the corpse, for example, because you might, imagine they were saying something, or they were engaging in some kind of other performance. It wouldn't have been something really boring. I mean, even Fadlan alludes to that with the prayer or whatever he heard. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that frustrates me about Ibn Fadlan there's many things that frustrate me about his account from an archaeologist's perspective. But one of the things that drives me crazy is that, of course, he goes into all this obsessive detail, relatively compared with what else we have for the period, about obviously the slave girls.
It is the only description we have. Yeah. I mean,
yes, sorry. Yeah. So we have to work with it. But then, of course, there's a very perfunctory description. And then they raise a mound.
It's very detailed, right?
And
suspiciously detailed.
And yet, what the archaeological record from at least southern and central Scandinavia shows us is that burial mounds we don't know what they called them in terms of detailed typology, but there's so many different kinds of funerary architecture, from standing stones, what we would call now curbed cairns, low flat monuments, relatively
the ship settings,
ship settings and different shape settings. I mean, one of the things I've published about is how perhaps we need to rethink these monuments and the terms we use, and we kind of default to seeing the mound as the preeminent and most important form of funerary monument. But actually, some of these, linking to your point about songs and performance, one of the points I've made is that these relatively low platforms, like the one I excavated in Sweden at Skamby over a small boat grave of the early Viking Age, these were never some of these monuments are robbed later, but there's no sense to my mind from the excavation that this was substantially robbed. It was only built in the Viking Age to be a one boulder thick, or perhaps two in some places, layer thick of stones. So they were covering, they were never trying to hide the dead or lock the dead down in massive mounds. Most of these cemeteries have low, small mounds that are more intimate and connected over the body shaped space, not necessarily these grand, exceptional, great mounds that we talk about for, say, Oseberg or Gokstad. Though those are really unusual. Even the wealthy graves are, still allowing access to the grave and performances, spaces. You're basically creating a stage on which you can have dialogues with the dead.
You can interact with the dead. Yeah.
more like a modern Scandinavian, or less so in Britain because we don't tend our graves quite as well, but more like one of the pristine Nordic cemeteries. They put a lot of effort in, even today, into, even though more secular nations, they still put a lot of effort into the family graves, or at least some people do. And I think we have to think about that more. I'm not saying they're only family spaces, but more, performed.
Dynamic spaces.
Dynamic is a good word. Yeah, yeah. And not just to do with the burial, but then continued rituals and practices afterwards. I mean, we have many cultures that go back to graves, so it's not a revelation. We can't reconstruct most of that. But I think, the fact that, I think thinking about these architectures and working on a site where you're excavating, and it did take me away from the stereotypes I was reading, the general default literature on the Viking Age, where big mounds, or even small versions, the small mounds are just small versions of the big mounds. It's not thinking about, you look at the arrangements and the sizes of the stones, all of those could be carried. And I know that because me and my 5 students, we had to reconstruct the monument in a day and a half after we finished our excavation. We didn't have any tractors, or we had, actually, the local farmer did help us with about 8 boulders, but the rest of it, we had to reconstruct that grave to consolidate the site after our excavation. And we could do it in a day and a half. Now, we didn't move most of the stones off the site, but by analogy, I would say 50 people in a day would make that monument. And you could see the different sizes of the stone. You could easily imagine older children, younger children, adults doing that work together, picking different stones from the neighboring fields.
So it was in a way community building.
I think so.
But it's, yeah.
The making of the mound and then the use of it is not about locking the dead in, and we shall build him like Beowulf, the old English poem, where the seafarers can see his mound. Yeah, that's for some, but I think for a lot of these funerary monuments are moments where you come together, you drink, you honor the dead, you socialize, and you work together. You do labor for the dead. It is a form of work that is linked to honoring the dead, as much as what you said. You sing, you perhaps drink, you eat, but it's about those are the things we can get at as archaeologists. We can't always work out what everything meant, but we can see the evidence of those practices. So I suppose half of our job that a lot of archaeologists over the last 30 years have talked about is we can't always answer the questions about what people believed, but we can get access to the work they did, the practices they performed, and
that's actually more important.
Yeah,
because when you're speaking about non-dogmatic religions, as these pre-Christian religions, these were about praxis, they were not about doxas. So I think it's all the more relevant what you do, because no matter how hard I try to retrieve religious beliefs from the texts, there are very clear limitations. And with regard to ritual practices, again, Christian monks do not mention them because they had a clear ideological purpose for doing that. So the work you do is all the more important in order to corroborate all these things.
And it's what I think the part of the problem is we're living in a secular society that has a stereotype for those that don't practice a religion about what religious people think. I've talked to many vicars, and they'll tell you from the pulpit one thing, and then you chat with them outside, and they'll go, I remember one of those hilarious interactions I had was this vicar who said to me, "Do you know my daughter's at university studying ancient history? I didn't know about all these ancient gods, so maybe they exist too." and I went, and I'm not particularly religious, but I just said, "Man, you're supposed to believe." Come on, but he was. I'm not saying he was typical, but he was a character. But then many vicars are, and the point is, many English vicars fit the stereotype, and they perform that stereotype. And when they're in a funeral and their wedding, they're somber. They do the role, and then their idea is they're chatting down the pub with everyone else in the community is, well, what would have Odin done? I don't know, but I bet he would have said this. And they're just having conversations. It's practical religion. It's even the most most overt and extremist form of Islam, of Christianity, of Buddhism, or whatever. There's still that variability and locality.
Absolutely.
So why would we think any different for Old Norse religion? And in terms of death ritual, I think a lot of people would have come away from those funerals as confused as us archaeologists and scholars. I think many people would have gone, "What was all that about? Oh, he just got very drunk. Oh, I thought he was performing some really special ritual. No, he was just mumbling nonsense for half an hour."
This reminds me a little bit about Helgi the Lean from the Book of Settlements. Helgi the Lean, who said he was worshipping Thor whenever on sea, and then when he comes to land, he was worshipping Jesus. Kind of work, Or there was also this story about a Viking who got baptized like 20 times because usually you got clothes, like white, clean clothes, and he was very upset. I think Notker speaks about him in his chronicle. And so the last time, the 20th time, he was very upset because he did not get any white clothes, and in his anger he shouted in the church that he was not going to be baptized ever again. So.
Never again. I'm not doing this every year, if you don't.
Exactly, yeah. And we do have, I think, more than one example of these molds that could be used both for Thor's hammers and for crosses in different Swedish sites. So I think that's clear point to be made here that these, beliefs, even different as they were, they could coexist in the same context. So.
I mean, that's a big point, isn't it, for the whole Viking Age, from the very earliest, from the late 8th century through. There was never a time, and I try and say this to upset people on purpose, not to upset their personal beliefs, but to get people. There was never a time when Scandinavia was not aware of the Christian faith. They were in constant interaction with Islam. There would have been Jewish merchants. We know that. There's never a period of time where there was a hermetically sealed, pure religion that existed unfettered and happy-go-lucky, and then suddenly these nasty foreigners came along with their monotheism. There was always this, and I know that's a very crude.
Again, that is a thing. I think it was very much influenced by popular culture, and not only by films, but also that's also something I saw in my study about metal music. This dichotomy between Christianity and paganism, with paganism being, the myth of the wild, good savage, and then the oppressor, which was Christianity, and they came and imposed their religion, and there was no dialogue whatsoever. It was just generally this very violent and aggressive thing, which I'm not saying it didn't happen. I mean, it happened with Charlemagne and the Saxons, for example, but that's not it's not something that we should generalize. I think that many of the people we were talking about living back then would have been aware of these new religious phenomena, and they would have adopted like maybe one habit at a time. So maybe, for example, in Sweden, you have evidence from cemeteries where people started to adopt the orientation of the graves following the Christian tradition, so east to west, to invoke this idea of resurrection. But it was one thing at the time. I mean, they wouldn't have adopted everything at once, but something that would have fit, that would have been acceptable for the way they thought back then. So it was really a process here going on. It was not really something all of a sudden. Never.
And death ritual reflects that. I mean, we're not denying there was incredible violence and oppression and moments of and similar. But the same goes for the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. I wouldn't deny them. Many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who died in the wars connected to those. But you can't reduce it down to a simple, oh look, here we are playing with my pet bird in a field, and there's a deer dancing by, and let me just say a prayer to Frigg or whatever it may be, and then suddenly the Christians arrive. And it's suddenly they are. We bring our God. They always have they have very posh English accents in films, don't they? They're always sort of, we bring our God. They always talk like they're sort of Shakespearean actors, and but I mean, but having said that, of course there is change, and the church, by the end of the Viking Age, is starting a process that takes generations of establishing churches. Well, the local elite are building the churches for their own benefit, and then honoring the dead in those church spaces. And of course that meant that those burial mounds are out of those kind of public ancestral spaces of the cemetery get decommissioned or adopted as places of Christian commemoration. And so yes, and the whole runestone tradition is at least part of that shift. So the late Viking Age runestones are showing us, not exclusively, but a primarily Christian or Christianizing society.
Exactly.
Wanting to keep their family connections, their land, their power, their stories, but also within that Christian context. So we see that diversity across the face in the Viking Age, and I think that's what the archaeology can show us. Again, generalization. There's lots of variability. There's a few runestones with Thor's hammers on, as you know, and there's many of them that don't have a religious affinity at all. But there is that adoption of a continental tradition, carve it on stone. Runes have been around a long time, but this is a bit of a craze, that spreads. And it becomes
it's a bit of a craze in Uppland in the 11th century.
And not everywhere, it's not the same everywhere.
It's very regional, yeah.
And there's some areas where we only have very late ones, and so again, it's about understanding that there was no single fixed belief and no single fixed way of honoring the dead, and different materials and different contexts could be drawn in at different moments to make points and make arguments in stone, arguments in graves about how the living relate to the dead. And the past is the thing that, as you rightly say, the cultural memory is a constant renegotiation, and the archaeological record is showing us that. As I said, I don't think, just as I said about ship burials, not many, or elaborate high status funerals, if you're living in one part of Scandinavia in the Viking Age, you may have only seen one or two per generation. You may not have seen that many runestones go up in the period where we think, this landscape would have been full of people just constantly chipping away runestones. But actually, you're looking at something, where you have the genealogies, you are literally looking at the deaths of individuals. Maybe there's exceptions where multiple runestones are going up to individuals, but most of the time it's not going to be the feature that if you went back there they would say, yeah, we're the people that carve runestones. It's not something that they would pick up on in the same way. When you have someone from another part of the globe comes to, say, a part of Germany or part of Romania or a part of Italy or a part of Britain and says, wow, you're really crazy, you have these plastic cups that are orange or something, and you go, I didn't know that. Is that the thing that you see as typical of us? I think the late Viking Age Scandinavia, no one would have seen themselves as that was the feature that made them special. They would have seen as that's what we're doing now. I don't think it would have been such a weird thing.
Yeah, and this another thing that strikes me is how much the later medieval literature engages with this distant past. I mean, we have all these stories not only about these mound dwellers and about heroic people breaking into these mounds, but there are also other possibilities of engaging with the past. For example, when you find very old characters in the Icelandic sagas, you have a bunch of legendary sagas with characters living up to 300 years. I can think of at least two examples. One is Arrowod, the saga of Arrowod, Örvarod, and the other one is Gestur from Norna Gesturþottr. And these are both characters who are really Methuselamic. They're 300 years old, and the author essentially uses them in order to provoke this dialogue with the distant past. And in both cases, there is some kind of prophecy involved, and the characters are more or less doomed to live that long of a life, and that is also a pretext for them to live all these adventures that take place in the Viking Age. But then again, at the end of these stories, they cannot really overcome that. They still belong to the past. They still have to die. In the story of Norna Gess, for example, which is very, very fascinating, there is this candle involved. So the character is only going to live as long as this candle doesn't burn up, which is why he puts out the candle and he preserves this as kind of like a memory. But then again, towards the end of his life, he thinks, well, the world has changed so much. I don't really belong here, so I'm going to lighten up the candle and let myself die. So in that sense, also these stories, like, they clearly show a tension going on between medieval people and the way the past keeps resurfacing in their lives and in these stories. I think there was a very, very dynamic relationship here, and these stories, although they're not historical, they can definitely offer us a little bit of information about cultural memory and mentalities of the people and how important the past would have been for them, and this whole tension growing all over the place between the present and the past.
You see, that's a question I have for you, because I'm really interested in it. I didn't know about that at all, to be honest with you. My knowledge of the written sources is mixed and sketchy, I confess. But I wanted to ask about this whole issue of how, see, well, let me put it this way, right? I teach my students that we have the formal story of the birth of archaeology as a discipline, and antiquarians, everything, the dilettantes, the literary minded elites who are collecting, recording, but no coherent argument. But then I flipped that around and tried to explain to them that we actually have evidence from that all societies are, in a way, a bit archaeological. They're not.
They were attracted, they're attracted
all,
by monuments.
They're engaging with their landscape. They're farming this landscape. They're hunting and fishing in this landscape. They are burying their dead in the landscape, building their houses, building barns. They are cutting down trees. They are intimately familiar with those landscapes. Even if they move, they rapidly, within years and decades, will become familiar with that landscape. They therefore have, and I'm not saying that modern society is disconnected, all that cliche, but they would have rapidly understood, not necessarily every archaeological feature, but they would have known what an old mound looked like. They would have known what their own
Mm,
graves of their fathers and mothers looked like.
definitely, yeah.
And
Yeah.
for me, I think I just wanted to know what you thought about that idea of perhaps it's inappropriate and misleading, but I always try to say to this, at least as an introductory idea, yeah, every society is a bit archaeological with their. What do you think about that for the Viking Age and, well, medieval people thinking about the Viking Age?
Well, like I said, the burial mounds play a very important role because they act like some kind of time portals. I mean, you can engage with the burial mound, and a lot of people do that, particularly in the legendary sagas, in the sense that they hope to retrieve something valuable, from the past that could also serve them to the present. But it's not always about burial mounds. Sometimes it can also be about these characters who are very ancient. And also a third relevant example, I think, is the story of the Seven Sleepers, which was very popular also during Iceland. So the Seven Sleepers is a story relating to the advent of Christianity. It happens during the time of Decius, the emperor who conducted all these oppressions of Christians. And then it is said, so it's an older story coming actually from Middle Eastern sources, Syriac sources in the 6th century, but it's gotten to be very, very popular during the Middle Ages, and it was also translated multiple times into Icelandic as well. So it is said that seven saints, so 7 holy people, they basically trapped themselves into a cave. They went there to hide themselves from the persecutions, but then they were sealed because the people of Decius came and they sealed them in this cave. And what happens is that they are awoken, I think 300 years later during the time of Theodosius, and they're still very much alive, and they have no conscience whatsoever about what happened. And this story is sometimes integrated into manuscripts in order to show that the past is very much alive. And it's kind of like a time capsule when you find these stories, because you kind of you can travel to the past, but at the same time it still remains the past. And I find the ending of the story also very telling for that, because you have one character called Malchus, and he goes with all the coins and he tries to tell the story to other people to convince them that he is this ancient man from the time of Decius. And eventually people believe him, but the moment they go all together to the cave to see the others and so on, they die. So I think that's also very relevant, because it's not a story about immortality. It's a story about the past coming back to life and then going back to what it is, because they don't really belong there. So that's one thing.
That's really, so there's this almost, and that's a sort of jumping back to what we're talking about. There is the Christian ideas of history and pre-Christian or non-Christian ideas of history may not have been diametrically opposed, because we have this, I think rightly, I'm very sympathetic with using anthropological concepts of animism and thinking about that for pagan Norse religion. I have no objection to that, but I think there is this easy to slot into this opposition. There was a linear sense of history and a Christian sense of ancestors and patriarchs and biblical, and hagiographic writing, and then there was a non-Christian traditional. And again, surely it's a bit all messy, isn't it? I mean, there is an interest in the past across that crude.
Yeah, exactly. And one more interesting thing about this story that I think is relevant to this whole discourse and story about the way we perceive time is that I forgot to mention it belongs to an Icelandic story called the Bergboaþáttur, where there is someone who has a conversation with a rock giant, and somehow there is this poem that induces the idea that people were somehow aware of the ancient, like, geological past, not only the human past, but there is a lot of reference to erosion, for example, also to lava, but metaphorically told, and all kinds of allusions to what might have happened before humans as well. And I find this fascinating, because this is not something you often get. There is usual engagement with the pagan past, but not really what was before. And this is one of the very few sources where we do get this impression that people might have also engaged with the deeper past. And I think that's perfectly reasonable, because they would have noticed, people living in Iceland, they would have noticed the difference, for example, between recently molten lava and the ancient lava that was solidified. They didn't have the terminology to describe it, but they would have noticed it, definitely.
Exactly. And when we're saying this, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone was sitting there able to remember the names of their great 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 grandfathers and what they ate for breakfast. We're not talking about societies like that. We're talking about societies that may have relatively perhaps shallow family histories, perhaps only great grandparents, but they have stories, they have they have this connection to the landscape, and they're able to make these observations. And this is something I think is really important, is that they would not have had an archaeological chronology and said, oh, this is a Bronze Age mound and it's clearly from the whatever. This is all typologies of the 19th centuries that we've inherited, and but they would have known old stuff. They would have been able to excavate into and find old graves.
Yeah.
We're finding lots of examples. Archaeologists are arguing about some of the traditions of, say, migration period, 5th, 6th century cremation, are very similar to the ways that people are treating in the same cemeteries in the 9th, 10th century. And that doesn't mean they're the same people. It just means that people are able to go back, uncover this stuff and make a connection. So actually, they're probably reinventing traditions. They're seeing Bronze Age ship-shaped stone settings and going, aha, that's a thing to do. We could try that, And so it doesn't mean that they're stuck in the past. They are creatively engaging.
They're rediscovering it.
Yeah. I think that's at least a connection point between our archaeological and written sources. I'm not saying they're telling us the same things, but I think it's a really healthy area of discussion, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And in Icelandic sagas, you also find a lot of episodes where landscapes are associated with death and burial, and there is definitely a memory of what people used to do in the past. In Laxdœla saga, for example, you have Hoskuld, a chieftain, very important one, and he is buried in the location that bears his name. And then the saga describes very beautifully how his son honors his father's memory by erecting a very, very prominent, massive burial mound, and he ensures that the site might serve in the future as this very lasting testament to his father's activity. So there is definitely a kind of memory, a cultural memory about what people used to do in pre-Christian times.
And yes, they are trying to. There is an awareness that their landscape inherits these mounds that were intended for them as an audience as well. So there's a sort of there's a dialogue going on there. I'm very interested in also the choices of what we think of as hidden practices, because not everything was intended to be public. I mean, there's at least two areas that I think archaeologists can look at this. Firstly, the whole issue of, when we see all these things in graves, did everyone get to see them? And this is something I've written about, and in terms of the process of backfilling the grave, of concealing, wrapping. We've got so much evidence of textiles, of wooden containers, of these objects weren't all just necessarily held up and going, we're putting this brooch with him, woohoo, and everyone, I think a lot of these objects were, that was my reconstruction there of a Viking funeral there. I don't know why, but I think a lot of these objects were not perhaps were selected, but not for public viewing. There's a secrecy to some of these rituals within the funeral. I don't know if that is revealed in any of the written sources at all.
No, but not in the written sources, but I think I do remember some runic inscriptions, the runic inscriptions that are written on flat stones, but they're not meant to be seen.
Yeah.
They're upside down. There are a couple of examples of those, so that might be interesting to see if there's a connection there. So there was definitely something meant for the dead person and not for the whole community to see.
And then there are, one area that is, of course, a major area of debate that links to funerary archaeology, but not indirectly, is how much the hoards we have are also, in a sense, funerary. And and I don't have a strong view on this argument. I'm perhaps not up to date on the latest debates, but the idea, because we have, is it Snorri that tells us that you bury the treasure, in honor of, not exactly in honor of Odin, but in following the laws, and this idea that to bury your treasure is for
sacrifice what's most precious to you. That's an idea with Snorri. Yeah.
Whether it's really that's going on or not, but you certainly, I'm thinking of Egil Skallagrimsson, where he takes all the silver he got from as a mercenary and just goes out because I don't know whether he's just the whole point is he's such a miserable old git, he's not going to give it to anyone, but he goes out and kills his own thrall, and so no one
Yeah,
knows where
yeah.
it is. And it just makes me wonder, we not everything is about public performance, even if that's, I don't know how, whether we should
I
take
just
that as
remembered the
typical.
case of the gold foils. I think it's a good argument to bring that. The gold foils, most of them I think they were found in Okra, and there are these like very minuscule gold foils depicting usually either one character who can be this dancer like type, usually naked, or the couple, which has been interpreted as kind of a wedding, also potentially associated with rituals of fertility and so on. But the thing is that these very, very tiny bits were found in post holes. So there was something covering them, most definitely. And when you find so much gold that was covered, and definitely in very, very small bits, then it makes you wonder, this does look like some kind of sacrifice made in a ritual context, because it wasn't meant to be found, it wasn't meant to be seen. It's just maybe the community sacrificing what they believe to be the most important thing to them, associating them with some kind of mythological image, and then putting it all there in order to create this assemblage of performance, maybe.
Exactly, and I don't think it's necessarily either or with the hordes, but yes, I think the gold foil figurines are a good example that people were honouring the gods and depositing things that weren't necessarily for public view. But I'm not saying we should default assume all silver hordes are for the gods, but I think there could be motives there that are linked to ideas of storage for for future use, or for future, there could be other ideas of time playing into that, and there's certainly they don't want to put them in the graves because they know the graves are, I think the thing about graves is they're very, like today, they're very public, they're vulnerable. If you can't defend them, if you can't agree by consensus that no one's going to rob it, they will be robbed.
I was wondering about the one in Valsier. Like it's the one of the richest ones in Sweden, and it hasn't been robbed. This is a sign for me that maybe some kind of very, very powerful political authority was at place at that in that particular region at that particular time, because it is really one of the richest burials ever uncovered in Sweden.
And I mean, and you think it's almost a miracle when these aren't robbed, and at some point, and some of it may be to do with serious superstitions that preside, and we certainly can see in parts of Europe where those historic traditions of superstition still persist in a population, and that's the only reason why standing stones and monuments survive. I can certainly talk about the Irish tradition, but also in parts of Scotland, where large parts of Scotland they've destroyed, prehistoric monuments have been destroyed. But I've talked to farmers who just they have no other rationale other than, and it's not scheduled, it's not protected monument. Did you know about this standing stone? Well, it's not been recorded by archaeologists, but I'm not touching it. So it's there.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's but there are different sort of thoughts. There's that respect, but it's fear. But then there's also you've got to have authorities to control some of that, or if you're putting a massive mound, and we know that the Oseberg ship was robbed and deliberately decommissioned as an act of political slighting of that monument, and so it does take they monuments rise and fall with dynasties. I'm thinking of the number of crosses that Harold Godwinson apparently erected to commemorate his victories from slaughtering all the Welsh in the Welsh borders. None of those crosses survive, and I wonder why. As soon as the Saxon dynasty ends, his dynasty ends, he was hated by the Welsh because before the Normans kicked him out, he spent a large portion of his adult life, up and down the Welsh border, causing trouble. And so monuments only survive as long as regimes do, and sometimes graves can escape that, but sometimes they can be targeted, as we've seen in Syria, for example, recently. They can be really the focus of the rage of a population seeking retribution, or symbolic, even, or more, perhaps not quite so targeted way, but in a more symbolic way of just we want to replace that group, and their ancestors no longer have a place, off they go. So we have
it's always a process of selection, isn't it? You choose what to remember, and of course that is always subjected to political ideology, and as you rightfully said, the change of political authority.
And religion is part of that mix, and both pagan and Christian must have been part of that story.
That's why the pagan stories were also erased.
Gosh, it's so much to get through, isn't there? But I
Yeah,
mean, I don't know if we've reached a point where we can conclude anything, but we've certainly given people lots of issues to think about. I don't know.
definitely. Monuments as enduring markers of memory, first of all. Perhaps how landscape also influences mortuary practices and commemoration.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, there's quite a lot we could talk more about landscape, but you certainly, the dead were an important part of the landscape of almost everywhere
Yeah.
in the Viking world, from every trading site and farm. The dead would have been a part of that topography, and yeah, that proximity
It's
to the
hard for
dead.
us to understand nowadays, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
people in the past really had a very special, a different relationship with death than we do today. I mean, yeah, of course, we do go to cemeteries as well, and we interact with our dead beloved and so on. But it's not the same thing, is it? I mean, the dead, for them, they were very much present in everyday life as well. It did not end. Death was a
No.
process. It didn't end
Yeah.
with the physical ending, you know.
Yeah, and I think
Mm.
cemeteries would have been places of not simply ritual of deposition, but commemoration. But perhaps, we have to entertain the possibilities in some parts of the Viking world. Cemeteries were used for other purposes, fairs, as they were in later medieval times. I'm guessing here because I don't think we have the sources to prove it. But, when you look at
Mm.
the cemeteries of Kaupang, where you can actually almost mark the historic road to the settlement through the
Yeah,
burial
yeah, yeah,
mounds, and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Dr. Marianne Moen's written about this, and other sites in Norway, where we can sort of, with some confidence, there's always questions about survival, but we can see how the cemeteries related to the settlements. Yeah,
Yeah,
they were
much
literally on
closer to the
everyone's doorstep.
settlements. Yeah, yeah, much closer to the settlements and had a much more direct relationship to
Yeah,
to the living than we do today. I mean, we have this
yeah,
very clear-cut,
yeah.
distinction that I think it would have made little sense for the
And
people
we
back
have to
then.
accept that there were people who were denied a good burial and not denied that commemoration, and enslaved people and perhaps families that fall into ill favor with the community
Children,
get yeah, children don't get that commemoration in the same way, and it may have been
yeah,
and I think a lot of authors have made that point, that it wasn't necessarily a society that has the same relationship with who gets to be called a person, and who gets that identity that is worthy of a particular funeral. And I think we have to
right,
remember, yes, it was a very unequal society in many ways.
exactly. Yeah. And also, I think we can wrap it up by coming back to the idea that started all this, that grave goods show a much more complex picture of the people, yeah, buried with them, and not always is it a matter of social status and direct reflection of their identity.
I suppose yes, I mean, perhaps a future conversation is to get into detail in some of the graves, and to sort of pick them apart a bit more. Not to,
Yeah,
I mean, there's different ways we could always have a chat where we sort of come up with alternate narratives and argue about it, just to get people to think about this, because actually there are some definitive reports written by archaeologists, and I read them, I go, or you could see it as this, and it's not
yeah,
necessarily that we have all the answers, but that might be a fun exercise at some point, because when you look at some of the furnished graves from the Isle of Man or from the Cumwhitten Cemetery, poor bone preservation but objects, and you're trying to work out, well, how this what are the inferences made by the archaeologists about their age, their gender, their social status, and then trying to work out what are the alternatives, how else could we see this evidence. And
exactly.
I
Yeah,
think that's a healthy academic discipline or disciplines, is one that will not be afraid to challenge the published definitive argument of an archaeologist and say, well, hang on, why can't we see it this way? And this is what I like talking to historians and literary scholars, because they're always going, hang on, why are you saying that? And I go, well, I don't really know. Oh, I'll tell you why. And then I go, but can't you say that? And I go, well, yes, you could, but then what about this? And you can get into those dialogues really in a healthy way.
yep, yep, totally agree. I'm wondering about the shields, for example. There are a couple of graves where some shields, usually 3, are placed on the body in Norway, and In Salme, in the Salme burials, there were more than three, I think. Yeah. So I was wondering about this habit. Maybe it has to do with the literature, like with this whole idea of fighting in a duel and you have a round of three, using three
Yes.
shields. Maybe it has to do with that, but I'm also thinking about alternative explanations because, like I said, the burials in Salme, they didn't have three shields. Like everyone's shield was there.
Yeah.
So, so
That's
yeah. So
really
maybe it
interesting,
had,
isn't it?
yeah, maybe it had some kind of other significance. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many questions. It's a
Yeah.
but that is a really interesting point of they would have any individual would have had access to more than one of these things. So, you're not going to last long in any duel, for example, as you say, or
Yeah.
even in a battlefield with just a single spear. You've got to think about these are selections of broader weapon sets that are available to families and communities and households and so on. But yeah, oh, so many questions.
Yeah, grave goods provision changed over time, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Great, Howard. This has been wonderful as usual, and yeah, hope the audience also enjoyed it.
I hope so
And
too.
think we'll be happy to have a third installment.
I think it'd be fab, wouldn't it? Whichever way we
Yeah.
go, we could. There's so many other topics, but we've done with revenants and grave goods. But I'm sure we can think of something else.
Yeah, maybe like you suggested, just take some very concrete cases, either from archaeology and from literature, and analyze them.
Yeah, I mean that would be good
Yeah.
actually to do a literature version or a funeral from the sagas and what and then maybe one and we could just sort of throw ideas back and forth and that would get people talking and chatting about
Yep.
what they think.
Yep. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Howard, and thank you, everyone. Enjoy.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.